The Romantic Period. Life and Works of Jane Austen. It isn't what we say or think that defines us, but what we do, by Jane Austen. This quote encourages us to be people of action, for it is what we choose to do throughout our life that will defines us. Kumbaga, sa buhay po natin, hindi natin masasabi kung sino tayo sa pamamagitan lamang ng kung ano ang iniisip o nararamdaman at nasasabi natin, kundi ito ay sa kung paano tayo kumilos o gumawa ng isang desisyon sa ating buhay. For example, sa mga taong nakakasalamuhan natin, 'di ba minsan, kung ano yung nakikita natin na ginagawa nila, yun yung binabasehan natin para masabi natin itong taong to ay mabuti o ang taong ito ba ay masama. Dahil nga po nakikita natin yung kanilang ginagawa. Introduction. Jane Austen, 1775 to 1817, was an English novelist, noted for her witty studies of early 19th century English society. Austen portrayed the quiet, day-to-day life of members of the upper middle class. Her works combine romantic comedy with social satire and psychological insight. There are two common themes in Austen's books. First is the loss of illusion, usually leading characters to a more mature outlook. The second is the clash between traditional moral ideals and the everyday demands of life. Because of her sensitivity to universal patterns of human behavior, Austen was one of the greatest novelists of the 19th and 20th centuries. The life of Jane Austen. She was born on 16 December 1775 in Steventon, Hampshire, England. Jane was the seventh child of 8. Apart from 3 years of school in Oxford, she attended with her older sister Cassandra. She was educated at home. At age of 13, she was writing amusing and instructive parodies and variations on 18th century literature, from sentimental novels to serious histories. At age of 23, she had written 3 novels. The first is Elinor and Marian, the second is First Impression, and the third is Susan. In 1801, the family moved to the town of Bath. After Jane's father's death in 1805, Jane, Cassandra, and their mother moved to the village of Chawton, very near Steventon. She led a secluded life with her family, never marrying. Her early works. The first period of her writing lasted from 1795 to 1798. During this time, she wrote the first version of Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, then Northanger Abbey. Ang unang version daw po nung Sense and Sensibility na ginawa ni Jane Austen ay itong Elinor and Marian na nakalagay dun sa dun sa kanyang 3 novels. Ito ay tungkol sa si Elinor at Marian ay dalawang babaeng magkapatid na mayroong magkaibang ugali. Si Elinor ay isang matapang na babae habang si Marian naman ay isang emotional or sensitive. Dito naman sa Pride and Prejudice, ang first version ay ang sinulat niyang First Impression, na kung saan ang main characters dito ay si Elizabeth Bennet and si Fitzwilliam Darcy. Austen's family preserved the writings she did as a teenager, which was published more than a century after her death. As Love and Friendship, it is a comic parody of 18th century melodramatic fiction. Austen's second important period of writing lasted from 1811 to 1816. Revised and prepared Sense and Sensibility, and Pride and Prejudice for publication. Wrote her last three complete novels, Mansfield Park, 1814, Emma, 1816, Persuasion, 1818. Several other incomplete works were published after Austen's death. The Watsons, 1923, Fragment of a Novel, 1925, and then Plan of a Novel, 1926. Her correspondence has been published as Jane Austen's Letter, 1932, Revised Edition, 1952. Her illness and death. Although the cause of Austen's final illness is not known for certain, the symptoms seem to suggest that she may have been affected by Addison's disease. Ito pong Addison disease ay also called as adrenal insufficiency. Ang nangyayari daw po sa isang taong may ganitong sakit ay yung hindi daw po sapat yung mga hormones na napoproduce ng ating katawan. Katulad po ng cortisol, na kung saan ang cortisol ay siyang nagko-control ng ating mood, motivation, and fear. Tsaka yun daw pong aldosterone. Tapos, ang main role po niya sa ating body is to regulate salt and water. Austen died in Winchester on 18 July 1817 at the age of 41. She was buried in Winchester Cathedral on 24 July 1817.
For the continuation of our report, I will tackle about the Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice. It is one of the notable works of Jane Austen. It has a complex novel mixing romance with realism. Austen used variety of features to make this novel seem more realistic and relevant to the period of 19th century. At the same time, it has also the touch of romance. The plot of Pride and Prejudice is like the plot of a romance. The social reality for women during 19th century was that it was almost impossible to survive without a man's care. So it was typical for young women to live in their father's house until she moved into her husband. Because of this social climate, the reality is that the five Bennet sisters do not have a choice about marriage. They must marry in order to secure their financial future. Jane Austen's most famous works include 6 well-read novels: Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, Northanger Abbey, and last is Persuasion. Reasons for novels' everlasting popularity. The first thing is the limitations and range. Austen takes the reader into the minds of the characters, and her acute observation makes us really feel we know them. Her use of irony and masterly. She has a good ear for dialogue, and her characters represent universal feelings and strengths, and so are instantly recognizable and interesting. Jane Austen's world, with its ability to ignore the outside world and comforting absence for disaster and horrific suffering, is one to which the modern reader can escape and find a certainty and tranquility that perhaps his life does not offer. The second thing is manner and morality. Manner matter greatly in Jane's world. Behavior must be controlled. Austen admires love, generosity, compassion, and common sense. She can sometimes be seen as callous, mercenary, and heartless. The third thing is the style. Clarity, economy, skillful use of dialogue, tight plotting, and satisfying completeness to her plots are the main features of Jane Austen's style. The fourth is other themes and topics. Houses, estates, and family wealth run like an undercurrent through many of the novels. Duty and decorum are used to describe manner. Rank and money matter greatly in the novels.
Pride and Prejudice. Let's discuss the settings, characters, and the summary of Pride and Prejudice. So, first one is the settings. The main settings in Pride and Prejudice are a series of homes and estates, including Longbourn is the Bennet's home. Longbourn is it's also where Mr. Bennet, his wife, and the 5 daughters live. It is an estate located in Hertfordshire near the town of Meryton. So next is the Netherfield Park. Is the residence of Mr. Bingley. So Netherfield Park, according to the location focus pictures, Netherfield Park is in reality the Basildon Park, near at Reading, Berkshire, a magnificent 18th century Palladian mansion. Ginamit lang pala yung pangalang Netherfield Park, pero ang totoong pangalan ng place na yon is Basildon Park. So, third one is Rosings. Rosings is Lady Catherine's estate. So, it is also the palatial estate of the Devore family and located in Kent near Hansford Parsonage. So, the house that Lady Catherine became to Mr. Colin. The last one is the Pemberley, is Mr. Darcy's estate. So, it is located near the fictional town of Lambton and believed by some to be the base on Lime Park. So, the next is the characters. So, Elizabeth Bennet, the second daughter of Mr. Bennet, she is the most intelligent and sensible of the 5 Bennet sisters. She is well-read and quick-witted with a tongue that occasionally proves too sharp for her own good. So, Elizabeth Bennet, at the end of the novel, she comes to love Darcy sincerely because she is one of the only women to stand up to him and to teach him a lesson that leads to true development in Darcy's character. So, Fitzwilliam Darcy. A wealthy gentleman, the master of Pemberley, and the nephew of Lady Catherine Devore. Though he is intelligent and honest, his excess of pride causes him to look down on his social inferiors. So he begins to admire more and more due to his consciousness of his position in life in comparison to Elizabeth. So, na-admire si Fitzwilliam Darcy dahil sa kabaligtaran ng buhay niya, si Elizabeth. So, next is Jane Bennet, the eldest and most beautiful Bennet sister. Jane is more reserved and gentler than Elizabeth. The easy pleasantness with which she and Bingley interact contrasts starkly with the mutual distaste that marks the encounters between Elizabeth and Darcy. So, si Jane Bennet is siya nga yung eldest and most beautiful among all Bennet's daughters. So, siya yung pinakamaganda na para rin naman siyang si Elizabeth pero mas maganda pa siya kay Elizabeth. So, si Charles Bingley, Darcy's considerably wealthy best friend, Bingley's purchase of Netherfield, an estate near the Bennet, served as the impetus for the novel. He is genial, well-intentioned gentleman whose easygoing nature contrasts with Darcy's initial discourteous demeanor. He is blissfully uncaring about class differences. So, si Charles Bingley is best friend ni Darcy. Siya yung mabait na kaibigan niya na hindi tumitingin sa class differences sa pagkakaiba-iba ng antas ng pamumuhay. So, next is Mr. Bennet, the patriarch of the Bennet family. A gentleman of modest income with 5 unmarried daughters, he has sarcastic, cynical sense of humor that he uses to forcefully irritate his wife through he loves his daughter, Elizabeth in particular. He often fails as a parent, preferring a withdraw from the never-ending marriage concerns of the women around him rather than offer help. So, si Mr. Bennet at saka si Mrs. Bennet is hindi ganun kaganda yung samahan. So, alang-alang sa kanilang mga anak, pinakikisamahan ni Mr. Bennet na lang yung kanyang asawa. So, Mrs. Bennet, Mr. Bennet's wife, a foolish, noisy woman whose only goal in life is to see her daughters married because of her low-breeding and often unbecoming behavior. Mr. Bennet often repels the very suitors whom she tries to attract for her daughters. So, si Mrs. Bennet, at the beginning of the novel, wala siyang ginusto kundi magkaroon lang ng mga asawa, yung 5 niyang anak na mga babae. Tapos, kabaligtaran siya ni Mr. Bennet na responsible parent sa 5 niyang mga anak. So, next, George Wickham. So, a handsome fortune-hunting militia officer. Wickham's good looks and charm attract Elizabeth initially, but Darcy's revelation about Wickham's disreputable past clues her into his true nature and simultaneously draws her closer to Darcy. So, si Wickham, sa unang pagkikita nila ni Elizabeth, na-attract siya sa kagandahan ni Elizabeth. Pero nung nalaman ni Elizabeth yung revelation ni Darcy about kay George Wickham, parang naiba yung principle niya ni Elizabeth kay George Wickham. So, Lydia Bennet, the youngest Bennet sister. She is gossipy, immature, and self-involved. Unlike Elizabeth, Lydia flings herself headlong into romance and ends up running off with Wickham. So, si Lydia Bennet sa novel is parang siya yung nakamana sa attitude ng kanyang ina na si Mrs. Bennet. So, next, Mr. Collins, a pompous, generally idiotic clergyman who stands to inherit Mr. Bennet's property. Mr. Collins' own social status is nothing to brag about, but he takes great pains to let everyone and anyone know that Lady Catherine de Bourgh served as his patroness. He is the worst combination of snobbish and obsequious. So, si Mr. Collins, siya din yung distant cousin ni Mr. Bennet. So, dito sa novel, si Mr. Collins yung pag namatay si Mr. Bennet, ay sa kanya mapupunta yung mga property ni Mr. Bennet because he is the nearest male heir would inherit the property. So, siya kasi yung pangalawang sa magpipinsan, pangalawang lalaki na pwedeng magmana ng mga property. So, Miss Bingley, Bingley's snobbish sisters. Miss Bingley wears inordinate disdains for Elizabeth's middle-class, Elizabeth's self-possessed characters even more. So, he play a role of a minor antagonist in the novel as a younger sister of Charles Bingley and Louisa Hurst. So, next, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. A rich, bossy noblewoman, Mr. Collins' patron and Darcy's aunt, Lady Catherine epitomizes class snobbery, especially in her attempts to order the middle-class Elizabeth away from her well-bred nephew. So, si Lady Catherine de Bourgh, so she tries to intimidate Elizabeth because she thinks that Elizabeth wants to marry Mr. Darcy. So, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, Mrs. Bennet's brother and his wife. The Gardiners, caring, nurturing, and full of common sense, often proved to be better parents of the Bennet daughters than Mr. Bennet and his wife. So, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner is required as a wise advisor for the Bennet sisters to compensate for the silliness of their mother. So, si Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth's dear friend, pragmatic where Elizabeth is romantic and also 6 years older than Elizabeth. Charlotte does not view love as the most vital component of a marriage. She is more interested in having a comfortable home. Thus, when Mr. Collins possesses, she accepts. So si Charlotte Lucas, she does not love Mr. Collins, but she marry him because of stable income and offer her the opportunity to have a home of her own. Kaya niya lang pinakasalan si Charlotte Lucas. So, si Mr. Collins ni Charlotte Lucas. Hindi niya talaga totoong mahal si Mr. Collins. Georgina Darcy. So, Darcy's sister, she is immensely pretty and just as shy. She has a great skill of playing the pianoforte. So, ito yung younger sister ni Darcy, ni Mr. Darcy, si Georgiana. So, next is Mary Bennet, the middle Bennet sister, bookish and pedantic. Mahilig siyang magbasa. So, si Catherine Bennet, the fourth Bennet sister, like Lydia, she is girlish, enthralled with the soldier. So, that's all for my assigned topic. So, thank you.
Summary, Chapter 1 to 2. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Nang dumating nga yung balita na si Charles Bingley, kung saan siya ay wealthy young gentleman na nagrent nga sa manor known as Netherfield Park, na parang nagulantang ang kanilang village, na kung saan nakatira din doon yung Bennet family. Yung Bennet family, meron silang 5 anak na mga hindi pa kasal, puro babae. Tapos si Mrs. Bennet, a foolish and fussy gossip, is the sort who agrees with the noble's opening word. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Nakita niya as a big opportunity si Mr. Bingley para sa kanyang mga anak, kung saan kung mapapangasawa man ng isa sa mga anak niya si Mr. Bingley, parang madali silang yayaman. Nakita niya yung yaman ni Mr. Bingley kasi doon sa character. Kaso, hindi pumayag si Mr. Bennet doon sa idea ni Mrs. Bennet. Kasi nga, nagpretend nga to si Mr. Bennet na wala siyang interest at hindi niya pa nakikilala si Mr. Bingley, kung saan inakilala naman na talaga niya. Tapos nung inireveal niya kay Mrs. Bennet at saka sa mga anak niya, parang nagsaya yung mga yun, nagsaya sila, tapos naging excited. Tapos, chapter 3 to 4, she is tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt me. Eager to learn more, Mrs. Bennet and the girls question Mr. Bennet incessantly. A few days later, Mr. Bingley returns the visit, though he does not meet Mr. Bennet's daughter. The Bennets invite him to dinner shortly afterward, but he is called away to London. Soon, however, he returned to Netherfield Park with his 2 sisters, his brother-in-law, and a friend named Darcy. Tapos nag-attend nga sila dun sa sa ball na malapit nga dun sa Meryton. Yun, the Bennet sister attend the ball with their mother. The eldest daughter, Jane, yan, sinayaw siya ng 2 beses ni Bingley, na kung saan, parang na-notice ni Elizabeth na nagugustuhan na nga ni Bingley si Jane. Tapos, dun sa narinig na Elizabeth, sinabi ni Bingley kay Darcy na si Jane daw ang parang pinakamaganda na nakita niya that he has ever beheld. Tapos, sinabi naman ni Bingley kay Darcy na bakit daw hindi isayaw si Elizabeth. Tapos nag-refuse siya. Tapos sinabi niya na she is tolerable but not handsome enough to attempt me. Ibig sabihin parang hindi siya pasok sa standard ni Darcy. Tapos simula nun parang hindi na ginusto ni Elizabeth si Darcy dahil sa comment niya. Tapos ayan, at the end of the evening, nag-uwi na sila, yung Bennet woman. Tapos, nag-akyat sila sa taas at kinuwento nila sa nanay nila na yung tungkol nga sa pagsayaw ni Mr. Bingley kay Jane ng 2 beses. Tapos, sinabi nilang dalawa na not well-mannered daw yung kapatid ni Bingley. Tapos, nag-insist naman si Jane na charming naman daw yun sa close conversation. Pero, Elizabeth continues to harbor a dislike for them. Tapos, the narrator then nag-provide yung narrator ng background ni Bingley. Naka-inherit daw ito ng 100,000 pounds sa kanyang tatay. Pero dun sa but for now, in spite of his sister complaints, he lived as a tenant. His friendship with Darcy is steady despite the contrast in their character illustrated in the respective reaction to the Meryton ball. Si Bingley, as cheerful and sociable, has excellent time and is taken with Jane. Darcy, more clever and less tactful, finds the people dull and even criticizes Jane for smiling too much. Tapos, ininsist nung kapatid ni Bingley na si Jane daw ay sweet girl. Next. Chapter 5 to 6. The Bennet neighbors are Sir William Lucas's wife and their children. The eldest of these children, si Charlotte, na kung saan si Charlotte naman ay closest friend ni Elizabeth. Tapos, napag-usapan nilang dalawa yung tungkol dun sa, sa ball. Na, sinayaw nga ng 2 beses si, Jane, ni Bingley. Kasi nga, parang, kinoconsider ni Bingley, si Jane to be the prettiest of the local girls. Tapos dun sa discussion nila, parang naipasok yung tungkol kay Mr. Darcy at saka kay Elizabeth na sinabi na ayaw na daw magpasayaw ni Elizabeth kay Darcy kasi nga doon sa narinig niya. Tapos parang proud kasi, parang mayabang. Tapos nung Bingley's sister exchange visit with the Bennets and attempt to befriend Elizabeth and Jane. Meanwhile, Bingley continues to pay attention to Jane and Elizabeth decides that her sister is in a way to be very much in love with him, but in concealing it very well, she discussed this with Charlotte Lucas, who comments that if Jane conceals it too well, Bingley may lose interest. Elizabeth says it is better for a young woman to be patient until she is sure of her feelings. Parang si Elizabeth kasi, parang gusto niya maging sure muna si Jane doon sa feelings niya bago tuluyang ma-in love kay Bingley. Tapos, Darcy find himself attracted to Elizabeth. Tapos, nung nagkakakilala na sila, parang, yun nga, parang nagugustuhan na ni Darcy sa Elizabeth. Tapos, sinabi niya na Miss Elizabeth is now the object of his admiration. Chapter 7 to 8. The readers learn that Mr. Bennet's property is entailed. Para mawawalang saysay yung property ni Mr. Bennet kung hindi ito maiilipat agad-agad pagkatapos mamatay ni Mr. Bennet o pagkatapos ng kamatayan ni Mr. Bennet sa lalaki. Kasi hindi nga ito maiilipat sa pangalan ng mga anak niyang babae. Dapat kasi ay lalaki. Tapos, his 2 youngest children, Catherine, nicknamed Kitty, and Lydia, entertains themselves by beginning a series of visits to their mother's sister, Mrs. Phillips, in the town of Meryton, and gossiping about the militia station there. One night, while the Bennets are discussing the soldiers over dinner, a note arrived inviting Jane to Netherfield Park for a day. Mrs. Bennet conspires to send Jane by horse rather than coach, knowing that it will rain and that Jane will consequently have to spend the night at Mr. Bingley's house. Unfortunately, their plan works out too well. Jane is shocked, falls ill, and is forced to remain at Netherfield as invalid. Elizabeth goes to visit her, hiking over on foot. When she arrives with sock and dirty stockings, she causes quite a stir, and is certain that the Bingleys hold her in contempt for her soiled clothes. Jane insists that her sister spend the night, and the Bingleys consent. That night, Elizabeth visits Jane. The Bingley sister poke fun at the Bennets. Darcy and Mr. Bingley defend them, though Darcy concedes first that he would not want his sister ever to go out on such a walking them poor marriage prospects. When Elizabeth returns to the room, the discussion turns to Darcy's library at his ancestral home of Pemberley, and then to Darcy's opinion on what constitutes an accomplished woman. After he and Bingley list the attributes that such a woman would possess, Elizabeth declares that she never saw such capacity and taste and application and elegance as you describe united, implying that Darcy is far too demanding. Parang demanding daw si Darcy. Next.
The next day, Mrs. Bennet arrives with Lydia and Catherine to visit Jane. To Elizabeth's dismay, Mrs. Bennet spends much of her visit trying to convince Bingley to remain at Netherfield. During her stay, Mrs. Bennet makes a general fool of herself, first by comparing country life to the city, and then by prattling on about Jane's beauty. Near the end of the visit, 15-year-old Lydia asks Bingley whether he will hold a ball at Netherfield Park. He replies that he must wait until Jane is fully recovered to hold a ball. In the evening, Elizabeth observed Miss Bingley peeling compliments upon Darcy as he writes to his sister. The conversation turns to Bingley's style of letter writing and then to Bingley's impetuous behavior, which entangles Elizabeth and Darcy in an argument over the virtues of accepting the advice of friends. Afterward, Miss Bingley plays a lively Scotch air on the pianoforte, and Elizabeth again refuses to dance with Darcy. Her refusal only increases his admiration, and he considers that we are not for the inferiority of her connection. He should be in some danger. Miss Bingley, observing his attraction, becomes jealous and spends the following day making fun of Elizabeth's family, inviting Darcy to imagine them connected to his proud and respectable line. That night, Miss Bingley begins reading an imitation of Darcy, a further attempt to impress him. She chooses her book merely because it is the second volume of the one that Darcy is reading. Of course, being uninterested in literature, she is quickly bored and says loudly, "I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. How much sooner one tires of anything that of a book. When I have a house of my own, I should be miserable if I have not an excellent library." Chapter 11 to 12. Miss Bingley spends the following night in a similar fashion, trying to attract Darcy's attention, first by reading, then by criticizing the foolishness of balls, and finally by walking about the room. Only when she asks Elizabeth to walk with her, however, does Darcy look up, and then the two men discuss the possibility of finding something to ridicule in his character. He states that his only fault is resentment. "My good opinion, once lost, is lost forever." Elizabeth replies that it is hard to laugh at a propensity to hate everybody, and Miss Bingley, observing Elizabeth's monopolization of Darcy's attention, once again insists on music. The next morning, Elizabeth writes to her mother to say that she and Jane are ready to return home. Mrs. Bennet wishes Jane to stay longer with Bingley, and she refuses to send the carriage. Elizabeth, anxious to be away, insists on borrowing Bingley's carriage, and she and her sister leave Netherfield Park. Darcy is glad to see them go, as Elizabeth attracts him more than he liked, considering her unsuitability as a prospect for matrimony. Chapter 13 to 15. The morning after his daughter's return from Netherfield, Mrs. Bennet informed his wife of an imminent visit from a Mr. William Collins, who will inherit Mr. Bennet's property. Mr. Collins, the reader learns from a letter he sends to the Bennets, is a clergyman whom the wealthy woman, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, has recently selected to serve her parish. His letter, as Mr. Bennet puts it, contains a mixture of servility and self-importance, and his personality is similar. He arrives at Longbourn and apologizes for being entitled to the Bennet's property, but spends much of his time admiring and complimenting the house that will one day be his. At dinner, Mr. Collins lavishes praise on Lady Catherine de Bourgh and her daughter, a lovely invalid who will only one day inherit the de Bourgh fortune. After the meal, he is asked to read the girls, but refuses to read a novel and reads from a book of sermon instead. Lydia becomes so bored that she interrupts his reading with more gossip about the soldiers. Mr. Collins is offended and abandons the reading, choosing to play a backgammon with Mr. Bennet. Mr. Collins is in search of wife, and when Mrs. Bennet hints that Jane may soon be engaged, he fixes his attention on Elizabeth. The day after his arrival, he accompanies the sisters to the town of Meryton, where they encounter on one of Lydia's officer friends. Mr. Denny then introduces his friend, Mr. Wickham, who has just joined the militia, and the young women find Wickham charming. While they converse, Darcy and Bingley happen by, and Elizabeth notices that Wickham and Darcy are extremely cold to each other. Darcy and Bingley depart, and the company pays a visit to Mrs. Phillips, and Mrs. Bennet's sister, who invites the Bennets and Mr. Collins to dine at her house the following night. The girl convinces her to invite Wickham as well. They return home, and Mr. Collins spends the evening telling Mrs. Bennet how greatly her sister's good reading impresses him. Chapter 16 to 17. At the Phillips dinner party, Wickham proves that center of attention, and Mr. Collins fade into the background. Eventually, Wickham and Elizabeth find themselves in conversation, and she hears his story. He had planned on attending the ministry rather than a militia, but was unable to do so because he lacked money. Darcy's father, Wickham says, had intended to provide for him, but Darcy used a loophole in the will to keep the money from himself. Elizabeth, who instinctively likes and trusts Wickham, accepts his story immediately. Later in the evening, while she is watching Mr. Collins, Wickham tells her that Darcy is Lady Catherine de Bourgh's nephew. He described the Lady Catherine as a dictatorial and insolent rather. Elizabeth leaves that party thinking of nothing but Mr. Wickham and what he had told her all the way home. She had decided that Darcy deserves nothing but contempt. Elizabeth expresses this feeling to Jane the next day, and Jane defends Darcy, saying that there is probably a misunderstanding between the two men. Elizabeth will have none of it, and when Bingley invites the neighborhood to a ball the following Tuesday, she looks forward to seeing Wickham. Unfortunately, she is forced to promise the first two dances to Mr. Collins. Chapter 18. Much to Elizabeth's dismay, Wickham does not attend the ball. Mr. Denny tells Elizabeth and Lydia and the Darcy presence keeps Wickham away from Netherfield. Elizabeth's unhappiness increased during too. Clumsy dances and Mr. Collins enriches her speak when she finds herself dancing with Darcy. The conversation is awkward, especially when she mentioned Wickham, a subject Darcy clearly wishes to avoid. At the end of the dance, Elizabeth encounters Miss Bingley, who warns her not to trust Wickham. Elizabeth assumes that Bingley's sister is only being spiteful, however, and chooses to ignore the warning. Jane then tells her sister that she has Bingley for information, but Wickham. But everything Bingley knows about the officer comes from Darcy and is therefore in Elizabeth's mind suspect. Mr. Collins meanwhile realized that Darcy is related to his patroness, Lady Catherine. In spite of Elizabeth's best attempts to dissuade him, he introduces himself. Darcy treats Mr. Collins with contempt, but Mr. Collins is too obtuse that does not notice. At supper, Mrs. Bennet discusses the hope for union of Bingley and Jane so loudly that Elizabeth criticized her. Noting that Darcy is listening, Mrs. Bennet, however, ignores Elizabeth and continues rambling about the impending marriage. At the end of the meal, Mary performs a terrible song for the company, and Mr. Collins delivers a speech of epic and absurd pomposity. Elizabeth feels that her family has completely embarrassed itself. Chapter 19 to 21. The next day, Mr. Collins proposed marriage to Elizabeth, assuming that she will be overjoyed. She turns him down as gently as possible, but he hints that she will change her mind shortly. Mrs. Bennet, who regards as a match between her daughter and Mr. Collins as advantageous, is infuriated. She tells Elizabeth that if she does not marry Mr. Collins, she will never see her again, and she asks Mr. Bennet to order Elizabeth to marry the clergyman. Her husband refuses, and befitting his wit and his desire to annoy his wife, actually informs his daughter that if she were to marry Mr. Collins, he would refuse to see her again. A few days after the refused proposal, Elizabeth encounters Wickham in Meryton. He apologizes for his absence from the ball and walks her home, where Elizabeth introduces him to her parents. That same day, a letter arrives for Jane and from Miss Bingley, informing her that Bingley and his park are returning to the city, indefinitely implying the Bingley plans to marry Darcy's sister, Georgiana. Elizabeth comforts Jane, telling her that this turn of events is all Miss Bingley's doing, not her brother's, and the Bingleys will return to Netherfield. Suddenly, news arrives that Mr. Collins has proposed to Charlotte Lucas, and that Elizabeth's friend has accepted. Elizabeth is shocked despite Charlotte's insistence that the match is the best for which she could hope. Miss Bennet, of course, is furious with her daughter for allowing her husband to escape her, and as the days goes by with no word from Bingley, Jane's marriage prospects to begin to appear limited. Miss Bingley sends another letter, this one praising the beauty and charm of Darcy's sister. The letter further states that Bingley will remain in London all winter, putting the end to the Bennets' hopes that he might return to Netherfield. Elizabeth is very upset by this news, and complains to Jane that people lack merit or sense, referring to Bingley for apparently abandoning Jane, and to Charlotte Lucas for agreeing to marry Mr. Collins. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bennet hopes of seeing her daughters wed fade rapidly. Mr. Bennet seems amused. He encouraged Elizabeth's interest in Wickham, so that she, like her sister, can be crossed in love. Mrs. Bennet brothers, Mr. Gardiner comes to the stay with the family, immediately recognizing Jane's sadness. The Gardiners invite Jane to accompany them back to London when they finish their visit, hoping that a change in a scenery might raise Jane's spirits. Jane accepts, excited also that in London she might get an opportunity to see Mr. Bingley. In the course of evenings spent with the various friends and the military officers, Mrs. Gardiner noticed that Elizabeth and Wickham, though not in a serious or sort of love, show a definite preference for each other. Because of his lack of money, Mrs. Gardiner does not think of Wickham as a good match for Elizabeth. Though she's fond of Wickham's stories of his life and around Darcy Estate at Pemberley, which is near where Mrs. Gardiner grew up. Chapter 26. On the first opportunity, Mrs. Gardiner warns Elizabeth that Wickham's lack of money makes him an unsuitable match. She further says that Elizabeth should be careful not to embarrass her father by becoming attached to Wickham. Elizabeth responds carefully, stating that she will try to keep Wickham from falling in love with her and she devotedly wishes not to upset her father, but concluding that all she can do is best. After Jane and the Gardiners depart for London, Mr. Collins returns for a visit as parish for his wedding. Elizabeth reluctantly promises to visit Charlotte after her marriage. Meanwhile, Jane's letter from London recounts how she called on Miss Bingley and how Bingley was called to her and visited her only briefly in return. Jane believes that Bingley's sister views her as an obstacle to her brothers marrying Georgiana Darcy. Mrs. Gardiner writes to Elizabeth to ask about Wickham, and Elizabeth replies that his attention has shifted to another girl, a Miss King who has just inherited a large fortune. This turn of events touches Elizabeth's heart, but slyly, and her vanity was satisfied with believing that she would have been his only choice, had fortune permitted it. The narrator then goes on to point out that Elizabeth's equanimity about Wickham trying to marry for money is somewhat out of joint with her disgust that Charlotte would do the same thing. As for Elizabeth, the very limited pain that Wickham's transfer of affection caused her makes her believe she was never in love with him. In March, Elizabeth travels with Sir William Lucas to visit Charlotte and her new husband. Mr. Collins on the way, they spend a night in London with Jane and the Gardiners. Elizabeth and Mrs. Gardiner speak about Wickham's attempts to win over Miss King. Mrs. Gardiner is critical of him, calling him mercenary, but Elizabeth defends him, calling him a prudent before Elizabeth leaves London. The Gardiners invite her to accompany them on a tour. Perhaps out of the lakes, Elizabeth gleefully accepts. When Elizabeth arrives in Hansford, the location of Mr. Collins' parish, the clergyman greets her enthusiastically, as does Charlotte on the second day of her visit. She sees Miss Devore, Lady Devore's daughter, from a window. The girl is sickly and cross, Elizabeth decides, and she imagined with some satisfaction Darcy marrying such an unappealing person. Miss Devore invites them to dine at Rosings, a mansion that owes even Sir William Lucas with a grandeur. At dinner, Lady Catherine dominates the conversation. After the meal, she grills Elizabeth concerning her upbringing, deciding the Bennet sisters have been badly reared. The failure of Mrs. Bennet to hire a governess, the girl's lack of musical and artistic talents, and Elizabeth's own impudence are all mentioned before the end of the evening. Chapter 30 to 32. Sir William departs after a week, satisfied with his daughter's contentment. Shortly thereafter, Darcy and a cousin named Colonel Fitzwilliam visit their aunt on Rosings. When Mr. Collins pays his respect, the two men accompany him back to his parsonage and visit briefly with Elizabeth and Charlotte. Another invitation to Rosings follows, and the Colonel Fitzwilliam pays special attention to Elizabeth during the dinner. After the meal, she plays the pianoforte and pokes fun at Darcy, informing Colonel Fitzwilliam of his bad behavior at Meryton Ball, and which he refused to dance with her. Lady Catherine lectures Elizabeth on the proper manner of playing the instrument, forcing Elizabeth to remain at the keyboard until the end of evening. The next day, Darcy visits the parsonage and tells Elizabeth that Bingley is unlikely to spend much of his time at Netherfield Park in the future. The rest of their conversation is awkward, and when Darcy departs, Charlotte declares that he must be in love with Elizabeth, or he would never have called in such an odd manner. In the days that follow, both Darcy and his cousin visit frequently. However, and eventually Charlotte surmises that it is perhaps Colonel Fitzwilliam who is interested in Elizabeth. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire you and love you. Elizabeth encounters Darcy and his cousin frequently in her walks to the countryside. During one conversation, Colonel Fitzwilliam that Darcy claims to have recently saved a friend from imprudent marriage. Elizabeth conjectures that the friend was Bingley and the imprudent marriage a marriage to Jane. She views Darcy as the agent of her sister's unhappiness. Alone the personage, Elizabeth is still mulling over what Fitzwilliam has told her when Darcy enters and abruptly declares his love for her. His proposal of marriage dwells at length upon her social inferiority, and Elizabeth's initially polite rejection turns into an angry accusation. She demands to know if he sabotages Jane's romance with Bingley. He admits that he did. She then repeats Wickham's accusation and declares that she thinks Darcy to be proud and selfish, and that marriage to him is utterly unthinkable. Darcy grimly departs. The following day, Elizabeth takes a walk and runs into Darcy, who gives her a letter. He walks away, and Elizabeth begins to read it. In the letter, Darcy again admits to attempting to break Bingley's romance with Jane, but he defends himself by arguing that Jane's attachment to his friend was not yet strong enough to lead by heartbreak. He adds that he did not wish Bingley to involve himself with the social encumbrance of marrying into the Bennet family, with his lack of both wealth and property. In relation to Wickham, the letter states that Darcy did provide for him after his father's death, and that the root of the quarrel lay in the attempt by Wickham to elope with Darcy's sister, Georgiana, in the hopes of obtaining her fortune. Elizabeth is stunned by this revelation, and will she dismiss some of what Darcy say about Jane and Bingley? His account of Wickham's doings causes her to reappraise the officer and decide that she was probably wrong to trust him. Her feelings toward Darcy suddenly entered into flux. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam leaving Rosings a week later, Elizabeth departs that parsonage despite Lady Catherine's insistence that she stay another 2 weeks. Before Elizabeth leaves, Mr. Collins informs her that he and Charlotte seems to be made for one another, which is clearly not true. He wishes Elizabeth the same happiness in marriage that he himself enjoys. After a short stay at the Gardiner's London's house, Elizabeth, joined by the Jane, returns home. The two are met by Catherine and Lydia, who talk of nothing but the soldiers as they ride home in their father's coach. The regiment is to be sent to Brington for the summers, and the two girls are hoping to convince their parents to summer there also. In the course of the conversation, Lydia mentioned with some satisfaction that Wickham is no longer interested in Miss King, who has gone to Liverpool to stay with her uncle. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet welcomed their daughters' homes, and the Lucases come from the dinner. Lydia prattles about the exciting coach ride and insists that the girls goes to Meryton to see the officers. Not wanting to see Wickham, Elizabeth refuses. Chapter 40 to 42. Elizabeth tells James that the truth about Wickham. They debate whether to expose him publicly, ultimately deciding against it. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bennet continues to bemoan the loss of Mr. Bingley as a husband for Jane, and voices her displeasure at the happy marriage of Charlotte and Mr. Collins. Lydia is invited to spend the summer in Brington by the wife of Colonel Forster. Mr. Bennet allows her to go, assuming that the colonel will keep her out of trouble. Elizabeth sees Wickham once more before his regiment departs, and they discuss Darcy in a guarded manner. Elizabeth avoids any mention of what she has discovered. The soldiers leaves Meriton for Bington. Kate is distraught to see them go and even more distraught that her sister is allowed to follow them. In July, Elizabeth accompanies the Gardiners on a tour of the Derbyshire countryside, and their travels take them close to Darcy Manor, Pemberley. Hearing that Darcy is not in the neighborhood, she agrees to take a tour of the estate. And at that moment, she felt that to be mistress of Pemberley might be something. As Elizabeth tours the beautiful estate of Pemberley with the Gardiners, she imagined what it would be like to be mistress to her, as does her wife. The housekeepers, Mr. Reynolds, showed them portraits of Darcy and Wickham and relates that Darcy, in his youth, was the sweetest, most generous-hearted boy in the world. She adds that he is the kindest of masters. I have never had a cross word from him in my life. Elizabeth is surprised to hear such an agreeable description of a man she considers unbearably arrogant. Miss Elizabeth and the Gardiners continue to explore the grounds. Darcy himself suddenly appears. He joins them in their walk, proving remarkably polite. Elizabeth is immediately embarrassed at having come to Pemberley after the events of recent months, and she assures Darcy that she came only because she thought that he was away. Darcy tells her that he has just arrived to prepare his home for a group guest that includes that Bingleys and his own sister, Georgiana. He asks Elizabeth if she would like to meet Georgiana, and Elizabeth replies that she would. After Darcy leaves them, the Gardiners comment on his good looks and good manners, so strikingly divergent from the account of Darcy's character that Elizabeth has given them. The next day, Darcy and Georgiana, who is pretty but very shy, but visit Elizabeth at her inn. Bingley join us then, and after a brief visit, they invited Elizabeth and the Gardiners, who perceive that Darcy is in love with their niece, to dine in Pemberley. The following morning, Elizabeth and Mrs. Gardiner visit Pemberley to call on Miss Darcy. Bingley's sisters are both present. When Darcy enters the room, Miss Bingley makes a spiteful comment to Elizabeth, noting that the departure of the militia from Meryton must be a great loss to your family. Elizabeth dodges the subject of the weekend. This deflection proves fortunate given the presence of Georgiana, as a reference to the man with whom she always eloped with embarrass her. After the guests depart, Miss Bingley attempts to criticize Elizabeth to Darcy and make a light remark about how he once thought Elizabeth rather pretty. Darcy replies that he now considers Elizabeth one of the handsomest women of my acquaintance. When Elizabeth returns to her inn, she finds two letters from Jane. The first relates that Lydia has eloped with Wickham. The second, that there is no word from the couple and that they may not be married yet. Elizabeth panics, realizing that if Wickham does not marry by Lydia, the reputation of both Lydia and the entire family will be ruined. As Elizabeth rushes out of the fine Gardiners, Darcy appears and she tells him the story. Darcy immediately blames himself for not exposing Wickham, and Elizabeth blames herself for the same reason. She decided to return home immediately after an apology to Darcy and his sister for breaking their dinner engagement. Elizabeth and the Gardiners has hastened back to the Bennet home in Longbourn. On the way home, Mr. Gardiner attempts to assure his niece that Wickham will certainly marry Lydia, because he will not want his own career and reputation ruined. Elizabeth replies by telling them generally about Wickham's past behavior, without revealing the details of his romance with Darcy's sister. When she gets home, Elizabeth learns that her father has gone to London in search of Lydia and Wickham. Miss Bennet, of course, is hysterical, blaming Colonel Forster for not taking of her daughter. In private, Jane assures Elizabeth that there was no way anyone could have known about their sister attached them to Wickham. Fretfully, they examined the letter that Lydia left for Colonel Forster's wife, in which she looks forward to signing her name Lydia Wickham. Mr. Gardiner follows Mr. Bennet to London and writes to Longbourn a few days later with the news that the search has been unsuccessful so far. He reports that Mr. Bennet is now going to every hotel in turn looking for the couple. Meanwhile, a letter arrives for Mr. Collins that in his usual manner accuses the Bennets of poor parenting and notes that Lydia's behavior reflects poorly on the family as a whole. More time passes before Mr. Gardner writes to say that attempts to trace Wickham through friends and family have failed. The letter further says, to Mrs. Bennet's consternation, that Mr. Bennet is returning home. 2 days after the Mr. Bennet's return to Longbourn, Mr. Gardner writes to tell him that Wickham and Lydia have been found at the Wickham will marry if the Bennets will guarantee him a small income. Mr. Bennet gladly acquiesces, deciding that marriage to a scandal is better than ruin of reputation. The Bennets assume that the Gardners have paid Wickham a sizable amount to get him to agree the wedding. Not a farthing less than £10,000. Mr. Bennet guesses the Bennets assume that they owe a deep debt to the relative Mrs. Bennet, is deliciously happy in having Lydia married, even when her husband and daughters point out how much it probably costs. Her happiness is tempered. When her husband refuses to allow Wickham and Lydia to visit or to provide his newly married daughter with money to purchase clothes. Elizabeth realized that her opinion of Darcy has changed so completely that if he were to propose to her again, she would accept. She understands, however, that given Lydia's embarrassing behavior and the addition of Wickham to the Bennet family, such a proposal seems extremely unlikely. Mr. Gardiner writes to Mr. Bennet again to inform him that Wickham has accepted a commission in the north of England. Lydia asks to be allowed to visit her family before she goes north with her new husband. After much disagreement, the Bennet allowed the newlyweds to stay at their home. The 10-day visit is difficult. Lydia is oblivious to all the trouble that she has caused, and Wickham behaves as he's done nothing wrong. One morning, while sitting with Jane and Elizabeth, Lydia describes her wedding and mentioned that Darcy was in the church. Elizabeth is amazed and sends a letter to Mrs. Gardiner asking for details. Mrs. Gardiner replies to Elizabeth that it was Darcy who found Lydia and Wickham, and Darcy who paid Wickham the money, and facilitated the marriage. She drops hints that Darcy did so because of his love for Elizabeth. Elizabeth's surprise is immense, and she is unsure whether to be upset or pleased. After Wickham and Lydia depart for the new home in the north, news arrives that Bingley is returning to the Netherfield Park for a few weeks. Mrs. Bennet refuses to visit him, much to the family's discomfort. 3 days after his arrival at Netherfield, however, Bingley comes to the Bennets' homes, accompanied by Darcy. Mrs. Bennet is overly attentive to Bingley and quite rude to Darcy, completely unaware that he was the only one who saved Lydia. Before departing, the gentleman promises to dine at the Longbourn soon. Darcy and Bingley come to dinner. Bingley places himself next to Jane and pays her much attention, while Darcy finds a seat at the opposite end of the table from Elizabeth. Rendering conversation between the two impossible, Elizabeth accepts that having been refused by her once, Darcy will not ask her to marry him again. Bingley visits the Bennets a few days later, and Mrs. Bennet invites him to dinner. He tells her that he is already engaged for that day, but eagerly accepts an invitation for the following day. He calls so early in the morning that he arrives before the women have gotten dressed. After the meal, Mrs. Bennet managed clumsily to leave Bingley alone with Jane, but he does not propose. The following day, however, Bingley goes shooting with Mr. Bennet, stays for dinner. After the meal, he finds himself alone with Jane again. But this time, he tells her that he will ask Mr. Bennet for permission to marry her. Mr. Bennet happily agrees, and Jane tells Elizabeth that she is the happiest creature in the world. The engagement settled, Bingley comes to visit often. James learned that B had no idea that she was in London over the winter, and she realizes that his sister were attempting to keep him away from her. Meanwhile, the neighborhood agrees that the Bennets are extremely fortunate in the daughter's marriage. A week after, Bingley and Jane become engaged. Lady Caroline de Bourgh visits the Bennets. The noblewoman wants to speak with Elizabeth and insists that they walk outside to hold a conversation. There, Lady Caroline informs Elizabeth that she has heard a rumor that Darcy is planning to marry her. Such a notion, Lady Caroline insists, is ridiculous given Elizabeth's low station in life and the tacit engagement of Darcy to her own daughter. Elizabeth conceals her surprise at this news and acts very coolly toward Lady Caroline. She admits that she and Darcy are not engaged, but despite the noblewoman's demand, refuses to promise not to enter into engagement to him. Lady Caroline claims that Elizabeth is bound to obey her by the claims of duty, honor, and gratitude. She presents the familiar objection. The Bennets have such low connection that Darcy marrying Elizabeth would ruin him in the opinion of all his friends, and make him the contempt of the world. Elizabeth defends her family, declaring, "I am gentleman's daughter," and asserts her independence from the exasperating control that such snobs as Mr. Collins, Miss Bingley, and Lady Caroline herself always attempt to exert over their social inferiors. "I am resolved," she says, "to act in the matter which will, in my own opinion, constitute my happiness, without reference to you, or to any person so wholly unconnected with me." Lady Caroline leaves furious and frustrated, and Elizabeth keeps their conversation secret. "My affection and wishes are unchanged, but one word from you will silence me on this subject forever." A short time later, a letter arrives from Mr. Collins that suggests that an engagement between Darcy and Elizabeth is imminent. The letter comes to Mr. Bennet, who reads it to Elizabeth and comments on the absurdity of the idea of an engagement with Darcy, who never looked at any woman but to see blemish, and who probably never looked at you in his life. A little while after Lady Caroline visit, Darcy again comes to stay with Bingley at Netherfield. The troop visit Bennets, and everyone takes a walk together. Elizabeth and Darcy lag behind, and when they are alone, Elizabeth thanks him for his generosity in saving Lydia Gold's name. Darcy replies that he did so only because Lydia is her sister. He then says that his feelings toward her have not changed since his proposal. Elizabeth tells him that her own feelings have changed, and she is now willing to marry him. That night, Elizabeth tells Jane about Darcy's intention to marry her. Stan cannot believe that Elizabeth truly loves Darcy. Elizabeth promises Jane that she does. The next day, Darcy and Elizabeth walk together again, and the night Darcy goes to Mr. Bennet asking for his consent to the match. Like Jane, Mr. Bennet needs Elizabeth to convince him that she does indeed care for Darcy. After she assures of her love, she tells him how Darcy feared of Wickham. Mrs. Bennet then learns of her daughter's engagement and is actually struck dumb for a time before bursting into cries of delight. Darcy and Elizabeth discuss how their love began and how it developed. Darcy writes to inform Lady Catherine of his engagement, while Mr. Bennet to Mr. Collins to do likewise. The Collins come to the Longbourn to congratulate the couple and escape the angry Lady Karen, as do the Lucases and Mrs. Phillips. After the wedding, Bingley purchased an estate near Pemberley, and the Bennet sisters visit one another frequently. Kate is kept away from the Lydia and her bad influence, and she matures greatly by spending time at her elder sister homes. Lydia and Wickham remain incorrigible, asking Darcy for money and visiting the Bingley so frequently that even the good-humored Bingley grows tired of them. Elizabeth becomes great friends with Georgina. She even comes to interact on the decent terms with Miss Bingley. Lady Catherine eventually accepts that marriage and visit her nephew and his wife at Pemberley. Darcy and Elizabeth continue to consider the Gardner close friends, grateful for the fact that they brought Elizabeth to Pemberley the first time and helped to bring up two together. Um, for the for this novel of for this novel I realized that you can find a person that that you that that will truly love you at the right time. Don't base in money. Instead, search for a love that will last. Elizabeth goals is um, is to do marriage. Marriage for love. Kumbaga, para sa aming mga lalaki, as a man, um, if we date a girl, a woman, uh, we we date we date them to marriage, not for constant feelings or instant feelings.